The explosion was not a single boom, it was a crack. A sharp, definitive snap of steel, followed by the sound of a giant tearing the sky in half. At 5:19 a.m. on June 12, 1944, the lead driver of a German ammunition convoy code named Gberis III hit his brakes. He stared, confused, into his side mirror. The second truck in his line, the Opel Blitz, carrying 3 tons of artillery shells, had simply vanished. It hadn't slowed down. It hadn't stalled. It was gone. He stopped his engine, plunging the narrow Alpine pass into a terrifying silence. Then, from the gorge 1,000 ft below, the sound finally reached him. A metallic scream followed by a colossal, ground-shaking detonation that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a new sun. The shock wave hit him seconds later, shattering his windshield. Before he could even scream, the third truck, braking desperately on the loose gravel, was struck by the fourth truck. The fifth truck slammed into them both. In less than 10 seconds, a chain reaction of fire and ammunition turned the cold Dudiabel, the Devil's Pass, into a vision of hell. When German investigators arrived, the pass was gone. The road itself had collapsed into the ravine. They found the lead driver, shell-shocked and babbling, miles away. He said the mountain ate the trucks. But one surviving guard found clinging to a rock whispered something else, something impossible. He said it wasn't partisans, it wasn't a bomb. He said it was a rope. This story, however, does not begin with an explosion. It begins 4 days earlier with a 4-year-old woman named Elodie. And it begins with a sound the Nazis had long since learned to ignore, the gentle thud of a goat's hoof on stone. Elodie was invisible, not by training, but by design. In the German military maps of occupied France, the Verrors Massif was a fortress of peaks and shadows, home to the Machi, the resistance. But Elodie was not Machi. She was not a soldier. She was in the eyes of the Reich, a statistic. Her father's farm, nestled in a high valley, had been requisitioned. Her brother, taken for labor in Germany, had not been heard from in 2 years. Elodie remained officially designated as a goat herder for the local German garrison, feeding the men who had stolen her life. She lived in the ruins of her old barn, surviving on watery soup and a profound bone-deep silence. The soldiers who saw her on the mountain paths barely registered her presence, a thin girl in a worn coat, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw and calloused. But where the soldiers saw a ghost, they should have seen a weapon. Liebau in Germany had quiet hands that understood the language of steel. Elodie had mountain hands, hands that understood the language of rope, stone, and gravity. Before the war, she had helped her father move timber. She knew with an instinct no engineer could teach precisely how much tension a hemp rope could take before it snapped. She knew how to tie a knot that would tighten under load, not slip. She knew the secret language of leverage, and she knew the mountain. She knew the shortcuts the Machi themselves had forgotten. She knew where the ground was solid granite and where it was loose shale, waiting for a single misplaced step to send it tumbling. Most importantly, she knew the Col du Diable, the Devil's Pass. It was the only route wide enough for the Wehrmacht supply trucks to cross the range. A ribbon of gravel carved into the side of a sheer 1,000 ft drop. For 3 years, she had watched them grinding convoys heavy with guns, fuel, and ammunition crawling past her goats, defiling her home. The Machi had tried to stop them. They had planted bombs. They had staged ambushes. They had lost dozens of men to German machine guns. The pass was too open. The cliffs were too sheer. The convoys were too well guarded. The resistance saw an fortress. Elodie saw a flaw. She saw the flaw every morning at dawn. When she took her goats to the high pastures, she saw it in the way the morning light hit the rock and in the way the wind whistled through the gorge. The Germans had made one fatal mistake. They had become bored. The convoys had run for 800 days without a single successful attack. The guards, once vigilant, now slouched in their seats, smoking, their rifles leaning against the truck doors. The drivers drove too fast, relying on the gravel berm, a low wall of piled stones and earth no more than 2 ft high to keep them from the edge. They trusted that berm. They trusted it with their lives. Eldero did not. She had watched it all winter. She knew it was nothing but loose rock and frozen mud, weakened by the spring thaw, held together by arrogance. The idea did not come to her in a flash of brilliance like El's bicycle chain. It came to her slowly, born of patience and rockfall. It started with a goat, a young kid, separated from its mother, trapped on a ledge just below the pass. Elodie had climbed down to retrieve it, her bare hands gripping the rock, her feet searching for purchase. To get back up, she had used her father's old logging rope. As she pulled herself and the goat to safety, the rope dislodged a small boulder. It fell, striking the gravel berm on the road below. The entire section of the berm, 20 ft of it, crumbled like sugar and vanished into the gorge. She stared at the gap, her heart pounding in her chest. The kid bleated beside her. She stared at the rope in her hand. Hemp, strong, flexible. A partisan would see a bomb. A soldier would see a machine gun. Elodie saw a 200 ft length of rope, a climbing harness, and a 400 lb boulder. She didn't need to destroy the road. She didn't need to fight the guards. She just needed to pull. She just needed to remove the one thing the drivers trusted. She needed to open a hole. The plan was insane. It was suicidal. It was, by all military definitions, a stupid, simple, impossible trick. And it would work. She spent the next 3 days preparing. She called it, in her mind, the trap. The resistance had workshops, explosives, networks. Elodie had a barn, a goat, and her father's tools. She found the boulder she needed, half buried in a stream bed a mile above the pass. It was granite, roughly the size of a hay bale, and impossibly heavy. But she didn't need to lift it. She just needed to move it. Using her knowledge of leverage, she used smaller rocks as fulcrums, rolling the massive stone an inch at a time over 3 nights, until it rested on a high ledge directly overlooking the narrowest, most fragile section of the Devil's Pass. Next, she prepared her anchor. This was the most critical part. She couldn't attach the rope to the boulder. It would be found. She had to create a trigger. She found a dead pine tree, its roots still clinging to the rock face 20 ft below the boulder. From there, she looped her main logging rope over a natural rock spur, creating a massive crude pulley. One end she tied to the dead tree's trunk. The other she left dangling, hidden in a crevice. The boulder itself was held in place by a separate, smaller rope, her father's old climbing line. She tied this secondary rope to the trunk of a living but very flexible birch sapling. The mechanism was now a 2-stage trap. When she was ready, she would descend to the main rope hidden below. She would pull it. The main rope would not pull the boulder. It would pull the dead pine tree. The pine tree, when it snapped, would rip the climbing rope from the birch sapling. Then, and only then, would 400 lb of granite fall. It wouldn't fall onto the road. It would fall onto the berm. A high-velocity precision strike designed to do one thing: erase the road's edge seconds before the convoy arrived. The final piece was the most dangerous. She needed an anchor point for herself, a place to hide, a place to pull from, where she could see the convoy but not be seen. There was only one spot, a tiny wind-blasted cave, no bigger than a coffin, set into the cliff face 500 ft directly below the pass. The soldiers called it the Eagle's Nest. Local legend said a man who hid there during a storm had gone mad from the sound of the wind. For Elodie, it was the only place. She coiled the main rope, strapped it to her back, and began the descent. It took her 4 hours, her fingers bleeding, her body aching, to reach the cave. She secured the rope, braced herself against the stone, and looked up. She could see it, a perfect 100 ft section of the cold WWII framed by the mouth of her cave. She was a spider sitting in the center of her web. Now she just had to wait for the flies. The night of June 11th was cold. A sharp wind howled up from the gorge, smelling of pine and damp earth. Elodie sat in the darkness, unmoving, her hands wrapped around the thick hemp rope. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She listened. She was not a soldier. She had no grand political motive. Her brother was gone. Her father was dead. Her farm was occupied. The world had pushed her and pushed her until her back was against this very mountain. She was no longer angry. She was no longer afraid. Just before dawn, she heard it. Far below in the valley, the faint, grinding rumble of heavy diesel engines climbing in low gear. Convoy Siberis 3. 5 Opel Blitz trucks carrying ammunition for the 15th Army. Elodie stood up in her tiny cave. She unwrapped her hands, spat on her palms, and took a new, firmer grip on the rope. She could feel the granite vibrating, the trucks getting closer. The sound was deafening now. The lead truck appeared, its headlights cutting through the gray mist. It passed 100 ft above her. Then the second truck, the one she wanted. She braced her feet against the back wall of the cave. She pulled. The rope went taut. She threw her entire 100B body against it. For a heart-topping second, nothing happened. The rope stretched, groaning as it took the strain. Then, 500 ft above her, she heard the sound she had been waiting for. Crack! The sound of a dead pine tree snapping in two. The 400 lb granite boulder released from its trigger dropped. It fell 40 ft, struck the gravel BM with the force of a cannonball, and punched a 30-foot hole in the side of the road. It was perfect. The driver of the second truck, blinded by the headlights of the truck in front, saw the gap. Half a second too late. He slammed his brakes, but his front right tire found only air. The truck tilted. It hung there, balanced for an impossible, agonizing moment between the road and the abyss. The driver's mate screamed, then gravity won. The Opel Blitz, heavy with 3 tons of artillery shells, pitched forward and vanished into the darkness. Elodie watched it fall. It seemed to take forever. A black shape tumbling end over end, growing smaller and smaller until it hit the bottom of the gorge. The explosion was not a boom. It was the sound of the world ending. The shock wave that followed was indescribable. It was not wind. It was a wall. It slammed into Elodie, ripping the rope from her hands, flattening her against the stone. She watched, stunned, as the remaining trucks, blinded by the flash, slammed into one another. The third truck, its cargo of mortar rounds cooking off, exploded. Then the fourth, the pass itself, weakened by the first explosion and battered by the subsequent blasts, began to crumble. The entire section of road where the convoy had stood simply broke away from the mountain and collapsed into the ravine. By 5:21 a.m., it was over. 5 trucks, their drivers, and 14 guards were gone. The cold WWII was impassable. Elodie remained in her cave, deafened, her hair singed, her hands raw and bleeding. She stared at the burning chasm where the road used to be. The soldiers in the garrison would blame the Machi. The Machi would claim the victory. Engineers would write reports about geological instability and partisan explosives. No one ever would believe it was one woman. The silence that followed the explosions was heavier, more profound than the noise that came before. It was a dead ringing void filled only by the hiss of burning tires and the groan of cooling metal far below. Elodie lay on the cold stone of her cave for a full hour. Her hands were useless, shredded by the rope. Her ears rang with the ghosts of the detonations. She was trapped 1,000 ft up a sheer cliff with no easy way down. Her escape would be harder than the attack. She had to retrieve the main rope, her only way up. But the shock wave had jammed it, wedging it between two pieces of granite. She pulled, her bloody hands slipping on the hemp. It wouldn't budge. For the first time, panic, cold and sharp, cut through her shock. The Germans would come. They would bring search teams, soldiers, dogs. They would scour this mountain until they found a reason. If they found her here, her death would be the kindest thing they offered. She took her father's old knife, the one she used for cutting goat cheese, and began to saw at the rope. Not to cut it free, but to shred it, thinning it fiber by fiber until she could tear it loose. It took another hour. Each pull sent fire up her arms. Finally, with a sound like a dry cough, the rope ripped free from the rock. She couldn't climb. Her hands were ruined. She would have to descend. She wrapped the rope around her waist, leaned back into the void, and began a desperate, uncontrolled rappel into the gorge, away from the pass, away from the burning trucks, into the one place the Germans would never look, the shadow of the abyss itself. By noon, the first German patrol arrived. It was not an investigation team. It was a conquest. Major Karl Brandt of the Wehrmacht's engineering corps stood at the edge of the chasm, his face pale with fury. Brandt was not a Gestapo thug. He was a man of logic, a man who believed in physics, stress loads, and concrete. What he was looking at was impossible. The cold duty bell was gone. Not damaged, not cratered, erased. The Maquis, his sergeant spat, gesturing at the wreckage. They used 1,000 kilos of explosives. They must have been digging for weeks. Brandt walked to the edge, ignoring the sergeant. He knelt, touching the fractured stone. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "This was not an explosive charge, Major. The rock is fractured outward. An internal charge, a bomb in the road would have left a fibroid crater, a bowl shape. This is a gash, as if the road was pulled from the mountain." He looked up, scanning the opposing cliff face. Nothing, just bare rock. He looked down into the gorge. The fires were still burning, casting a sickly orange light. "Geological instability," the sergeant offered, reading from the initial field report. "The vibrations from the lead truck must have what?" Brandt snapped. "Caused a perfectly timed selective earthquake that only affected the road after the lead truck was safe, and during the passage of an ammunition convoy. No, this was an act, but it was not a bomb. Brandt was a builder. He saw the world in terms of construction and deconstruction. And this was a masterpiece of deconstruction. "Get me the mountain infantry," Brandt ordered. "I want every rock on that opposite cliff face inspected. I want every trail, every ledge, every cave." He was convinced the attack had come from a sniper's nest, perhaps a new type of anti-tank rocket he hadn't heard of. He was still thinking in terms of weapons. He had not yet begun to think in terms of rope. While Brandt's men searched the cliffs, Elodie was miles away, crawling through the icy river at the bottom of the gorge. The freezing water was the only thing that kept her from fainting from the pain in her hands. It washed away the blood, the gunpowder residue, and her scent. By nightfall, she had climbed back up the other side of the valley, emerging near her own ruined barn like a ghost returning to its grave. She stumbled inside, collapsed onto her straw mattress, and for 12 hours she did not move. When she woke, the garrison was in a state of panic. The Machi, smelling German blood, had already claimed responsibility. Radio transmissions intercepted by the British proudly announced that the Vero resistance had dealt a crippling blow to the occupier, destroying a vital supply line. This perversely was the best thing that could have happened to Elodie. The Germans wanted to believe it was the Machi. It was an enemy they understood, an enemy they could round up, interrogate, and execute. SS patrols summoned by the disaster descended on the nearby villages. Reprisals began. The mayor of a neighboring town was shot. 10 men were taken as hostages. The Machi, having claimed the victory, now had to deal with the consequences. And Major Brand, he was not satisfied. His search teams had found nothing. No sniper nest, no rocket casings, no bomb fragments. On the third day, a young private, dangling from a rope 500 FT below the pass, found something. It wasn't a weapon. It was a clue. It was a piece of a length of dead pine, scarred and splintered. But the break, it wasn't a natural break. It had been snapped by an immense sudden force, and wrapped deep in its bark, the private found a single 2-in fiber of old hemp rope. Brandt held the fiber in his glove. He looked at the shattered pine. He looked up at the cliff face high above where the boulder had once rested. His mind began to work, not like a soldier, but like the engineer he was. He saw the forces. He saw the vectors, a trigger, a pulley, a counterweight. It wasn't a bomb, he whispered to himself. It was a trap, a deadfall. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A bomb was brute force. This was intelligence. This was elegant. And it meant the saboteur was not Maki. The Maki used dynamite. They were soldiers. This was something else. This was local. Someone who knew this mountain. Someone who knew how to move timber, how to work with rope. Someone like a farmer, or a logger, or a goat herder. His search had been focused on the men. His worldview had been focused on soldiers. He had made a critical, arrogant mistake. "Sergeant," Brandt said, his voice cold, "get me the records for every civilian registered in this valley. Every man, every woman, every child. I want to know who lives on this mountain." The hunt had changed. He was no longer looking for an army. He was looking for a single invisible person. The next morning, Elodie was outside her barn trying to milk her goat. Her hands were wrapped in dirty rags, her face pale. She told the garrison soldiers who passed that she had fallen, that her hands were stupid and had slipped. She watched a staff car grind up the road. Major Brandt stepped out. He was not like the other soldiers. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just looked. He walked through the tiny village, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the logging tools hanging in a shed, the coils of rope used for livestock. He was cataloging a population of experts. Then he saw Elodie. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. She did not look up, keeping her head bowed, her hands fumbling with the goat. "You live here," he stated. "Yes, Herr Major," she whispered, her French thick with a local accent. "You are the goat herder. You walk these mountains every day." "Yes, Herr Major for the garrison," for he stared at her thin frame, her dirty face, her submissive posture. This was a ghost, a non-entity. He should have moved on, but then his eyes fell to her hands. The rags were soaked not just with dirt, but with a faint reddish-brown stain, and they were wrapped tightly, not like someone who had a simple fall, but like someone trying to bind a catastrophic injury. He saw the raw, shredded skin peeking out. Those were not scrapes. Those were rope burns. A deep, cold silence settled between them. Elodie could feel his gaze on her hands. She stopped breathing, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Brandt looked from her hands to the coil of hemp rope hanging on her barn door, and then up toward the cold Dudiaba, its broken form just visible in the distance. He didn't know. He couldn't know. But a single terrible mathematical equation was forming in his mind. He leaned in, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "That's a terrible injury," he said, gesturing to her hands. "How exactly did you say you fell?" Elodie's mind went blank. The world narrowed to this single moment. The goat heard her and the engineer, the ghost, and the hunter. She had to answer. The wrong word, the wrong pause, and her life was over. Elodie's heart was not a drum, it was a block of ice. She forced her body to tremble, to shake, not with defiance, but with the pathetic terror he expected. She looked up, her eyes wide, tears welling. She did not look at his face, but at his chest. At the iron cross pinned to his uniform fell Herr Major. She whimpered, her voice cracking. My goat, the little one. He was on the high rocks. I climbed the rope. It slipped. I am stupid. So stupid. She was feeding him the exact words he wanted to hear. Stupid. Clumsy. A woman. Brandt stared at her, his eyes like blue ice. He saw the rope burns. He saw the coil of rope on the barn. He saw the chasm where his convoy used to be. And he saw a 4-year-old girl crying, her hands ruined because of a goat. It was too perfect. It was too convenient. Or was it the simple, idiotic truth? His mind, the mind of an engineer, raced. Could she have done it? Could this child have conceived and executed a plan of this complexity, to move a 400 lb boulder, rig a 2-stage trigger, and rappel into a cave 500 ft down a sheer cliff? All in secret. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet the alternative, that the Machi had built an invisible, silent, perfect weapon, was just as impossible. He was trapped between two realities, one that was insulting and one that was terrifying. But he was also a soldier, and he needed a culprit. The SS were demanding arrests. Berlin was demanding answers. "Which goat?" he asked, his voice flat. Elodie pointed her shaking bandaged hand, gesturing to a small white kid chewing on a weed. "That one Herr Major. He is a devil." Brandt looked at the goat. He looked back at Elodie. He saw the terror in her eyes, the dirt on her face, and he made his choice. He could not arrest this woman. What would he write in his report? Sabotage suspect, one goat herder. Evidence, rope burns, and a disobedient goat. He would be the laughingstock of the Wehrmacht. His career would be over. No, the Machi had to be the enemy. The honor of the German army demanded it. He turned away from her, his mind made up. He would write in his report that he had found nothing, that the Machi explosives combined with geological instability had destroyed the site so completely that no evidence remained. It was a clean, bureaucratic answer. "Be more careful," Brandt said, his voice hard. He did not look at her again. "Keep your goats off the high rocks and get those hands cleaned. You are a disgrace to the Reich's hygiene standards." He got back in his car. The door slammed, a sound as final as a gunshot. Elodie J. Rowe watched the car drive away, the dust settling in its wake. She did not move. She did not breathe. The ice in her chest did not melt. She waited until the sound of his engine was gone. Then she walked into her barn, gathered a half loaf of bread, her father's knife, and the remaining coil of rope. She did not look back. She did not run. She simply walked up into the high mountains toward the snow line, following the paths only the goats knew. By nightfall, Elodie was gone. Major Brandt returned to his office. He filed his report, blaming the Machi. The reprisal killings continued. The Machi, believing their own propaganda, grew bolder, launching 2 more attacks. But Brandt was haunted. He couldn't sleep. He kept seeing those rope burns. He kept seeing the physics of the trap. He, the master engineer, had been defeated by what? He was recalled 2 months later. His failure at the pass, a black mark on his record. His superiors noted he had become unreliable, obsessed. He was transferred to the Eastern Front to supervise the destruction of bridges during the Great Retreat, a builder forced to become a demolitions man. And the pass, the cold duty bell, It was never rebuilt. The German engineers, lacking the heavy equipment, could only clear a narrow mule track for the rest of the war. All heavy supplies for the 15th Army had to be rerouted 200 kilometers to the south. The delay was catastrophic. The ammunition in those 5 trucks, the artillery shells, the mortar rounds, had been destined for the coastal batteries in Normandy. When the Allies landed just weeks later, several German artillery positions, the ones that should have raked the beaches, were reported dangerously low on ammunition. They were overrun in hours. History, in its grand sweeping narrative, recorded the D-Day landings as a triumph of strategy. It never recorded the goat herder, whose stupid rope trick had silently disarmed a key part of the Atlantic Wall. Elodie was never seen again. Official records, if they ever existed, were lost. Her name was not on any list of Maquis heroes. She was not in any report. She vanished into the mountains she had saved. But like Loch Bauer's chain link, the story did not die. It just went quiet. Decades later, in the 1982 seconds, a young historian was studying the German occupation of the Wehrmacht. He was digging through the unfiled archives of Major Karl Brandt, which had been recovered from his estate in Berlin. Most of it was dry engineering notes, stresses, load barriers, concrete mixtures. But then the historian found a private journal on a page dated June 15, 1944. Brandt had written a long, frantic entry, not in official German, but in hurried personal script. It was not the Mackay, he wrote. The search was clean, no explosives, nothing. But I found the trigger point, a snapped pine, and I found her. The goat girl with the hands got in him. The rope burns on her hands. She looked me in the eye and lied, and I let her. How can a man build a 1,000-year Reich if he can be defeated by a girl, a goat, and a piece of rope? The historian read the entry, stunned. He checked the official reports. There was no mention of a girl, no mention of a rope. The story was invisible. It existed only in the burn marks on a woman's hands and in the private, humiliated confession of a Nazi engineer. The historian would later add a small, anonymous footnote to his book. One unverified and likely apocryphal report suggests the Culu Diablo incident was not a partisan attack, but a deliberate act of sabotage by a local civilian, possibly a woman. That was all a footnote. But the legend in the valley, the old ones still tell it. They don't talk about the Mach Dev Evra, the spirit of the goat. They say that when the arrogance of men grows too loud, a silence returns to the mountains. A silence that knows how to tie knots. The film would end here. The camera drifting over the Col Diablo, now a green, grassy scar on the side of the mountain. Peaceful, beautiful. The narrator's voice, low and measured, would linger over the final lines. Wars are fought with armies, with steel, with grand strategies, but they are won and lost in moments of impossible human choice. The Reich was a machine of perfect, brutal logic. Elodie was a simple mountain equation. She didn't fight the machine. She didn't try to destroy it. She just found the flaw in its arrogance. She cut the one rope it trusted and let gravity do the rest. The sound fades, only the faint whistling of wind over a high mountain pass, and perhaps in the distance, the faint hollow thud of a single goat's hoof landing on stone. Moon.